Every year, thousands of people travel to high altitude environment for tourism, adventure seeking, or to train and compete in various sports. Unfortunately, these trips can be marred by the effects of acute altitude sickness, and the symptoms vary from person to person. To understand why people are affected differently, we have to look at how the body is affected by altitude. So, how is altitude different to sea level? So, let's take a look at this. Air is comprised of different molecules, as we know, with nitrogen and oxygen making up the majority of each breath we take. This composition of air remains consistent whether we are at sea level or at altitude. However, with altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen in this air changes. At sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is 159 mmHg, whereas at 8,848 meters above sea level, the summit of Mount Everest, for example, the partial pressure of oxygen is only 53 mmHg. At high altitudes, oxygen molecules are further apart because there is less pressure to push them together. This effectively means there are fewer oxygen molecules in the same volume of air as we inhale. In scientific studies, this is often referred to as hypoxia. So, what exactly happens in the body in high altitudes? Within seconds of exposure to altitude, ventilation is increased, meaning we start trying to breathe more as the body responds to less oxygen in each breath and it attempts to increase oxygen uptake. So, despite this response, there is still less oxygen throughout your entire circulatory system, meaning less oxygen reaches your muscles, which will obviously limit exercise performance or any sort of performance in general. So, within the first few hours of altitude exposure, water loss also increases, which can result in dehydration. Altitude can also increase your metabolism while suppressing your appetite, meaning you're gonna have to eat a lot more than you think to maintain a neutral energy balance. So, so when people are exposed to altitude for several days or weeks, their bodies begin to adjust, which is called acclimation, to the low oxygen environment. The increase in breathing that was initiated in the first few seconds of altitude exposure remains, and hemoglobin levels, the protein in our blood that carries oxygen, increases along with the ratio of blood vessels to muscle mass. So, why do only some people get altitude sickness? Many people who ascend to moderate or high altitudes experience the effects of acute altitude sickness. Symptoms of this sickness typically begin within 6 to 48 hours after the altitude exposure begins and includes headache, nausea, lethargy, dizziness, and disturbed sleep. So these symptoms are more prevalent in people who ascend quickly to altitudes at above 2,500 meters, which is many hikers who are advised to climb slowly, particularly if they've not been to altitudes before. It's difficult to predict who will be adversely affected by altitude exposure. Even in elite athletes, high levels of fitness are not protective for altitude sickness. There's some evidence that those who experience the worst symptoms have a low ventilatory response to hypoxia. So, just as some people aren't great singers or footballers, basketball players, some people's body are just less able to cope with the reduction in oxygen in their systems at those altitudes. There are also disorders that impact on the blood's oxygen carrying capacity, such as thalassemia, which can increase the risk of symptoms. But the best predictor of who may suffer from altitude sickness is a history of symptoms when being exposed to altitude previously. Which begs another question: how are high altitude natives different? People who reside at altitudes are known to have greater capacity for physical work at altitude. For example, the Sherpas who reside in the mountainous regions of Nepal are renowned for their mountaineering prowess. High altitude natives exhibit large lung volume and greater efficiency of oxygen transport to tissues both at rest and during exercise. While there is debate over whether these characteristics are genetic or the result of altitude exposure throughout their entire life, they provide high altitude natives with a distinct advantage over lowlander during activities in hypoxia. So, unless you're a Sherpa, it's best to ascend slowly to give your body more time to adjust to the challenges of a hypoxic environment. I truly hope you all were able to really learn and understand how altitude affects our body. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.